There's a specific moment when narcissistic behavior can become noticeably more aggressive, and understanding that moment matters because it has much less to do with the actual situation than most people initially realize. The attack may appear to come out of nowhere. One minute everything seems relatively normal, and the next you're being criticized, provoked, accused, humiliated, ignored, or pulled into an argument you never intended to have. But often the timing isn't as random as it feels. Today we're going to examine the moments when narcissistic attacks are most likely to appear, why those moments can feel strangely predictable once you understand the pattern, and why recognizing the timing can help you stop interpreting every attack as evidence that you somehow caused it. Let's start with the most important moment of all, when the narcissist feels that they're losing control of your attention. This doesn't necessarily mean you've announced that you're leaving. Sometimes the change is much smaller. You're no longer responding immediately. You're spending more time with other people. You're becoming less emotionally reactive. You're no longer explaining yourself for an hour. You're making decisions without asking for approval. You're becoming comfortable with silence. You're simply becoming less available for the emotional cycle. And that change can be extremely significant, because in a controlling relationship, your reactions can become part of the relationship's emotional structure. If the narcissist knows exactly how you'll respond to anger, guilt, withdrawal, criticism, or affection, that predictability can make the dynamic easier to maintain. But when your reactions change, the old pattern becomes less reliable. This is why an attack can sometimes appear precisely when you're becoming calmer. You might think, things were finally getting better. Why did he suddenly start something? But the timing itself may tell you something. Your calmness may represent independence. Your silence may represent detachment. Your refusal to argue may represent a loss of emotional access. And when someone is accustomed to having strong influence over your emotional state, your increasing independence can become deeply uncomfortable. The second moment is when you set a boundary that used to be negotiable. This is one of the clearest patterns to watch. Maybe you used to explain yourself every time he became angry. Now you simply end the conversation. Maybe you used to answer every message immediately. Now you respond when you're actually available. Maybe you used to tolerate insults because you didn't want another argument. Now you leave the conversation the moment disrespect begins. Maybe you used to accept apologies without meaningful change. Now you look at behavior instead of promises. The boundary itself may be completely reasonable, but the reaction to the boundary can become intense. Suddenly you're called selfish, cold, disrespectful, difficult, unloving, changed. The focus moves away from what happened and toward your decision to respond differently. And this is where you need to stay grounded. Someone being angry about your boundary doesn't automatically mean the boundary is wrong. Sometimes anger is simply the reaction you receive when someone discovers that an old method of getting access to you no longer works. The third moment is when you're experiencing success without them. This can be especially important. You start improving your life. You become more confident. Your work improves. Your social circle expands. You start taking care of yourself. You look happier. You stop talking about the relationship. And instead of celebrating your growth, the narcissist may suddenly become critical. They may minimize what you've accomplished. They may find something wrong with your appearance. They may question your decisions. They may make sarcastic comments. They may suddenly remind you of an old mistake. Why? Because your independence changes the emotional balance. When your sense of worth no longer depends on their approval, their ability to influence you decreases. And sometimes the attack isn't designed to destroy your entire life. It's designed simply to create enough emotional disturbance that you start looking toward them again. That's why a seemingly random insult can be so effective. You could be having a great day. One comment arrives. Suddenly you're thinking about them for the next 6 hours. You replay what they said. You wonder whether they were right. You become angry. You want to defend yourself. You want to explain. And without realizing it, they've regained your attention. That's an important pattern to recognize. The goal of manipulation isn't always to make you love them. Sometimes it's simply to keep you emotionally engaged. Because anger is still engagement. Defending yourself is engagement. Trying to prove them wrong is engagement. Explaining your intentions is engagement. And if the relationship has trained you to respond automatically, even negative attention can become a form of continued access. The fourth moment is when you stop chasing them after withdrawal. This is another major turning point. Imagine the usual cycle. They become distant. You become anxious. You ask what's wrong. They remain cold. You try harder. Eventually, they return. That pattern teaches both people something. It teaches you that their withdrawal means you need to pursue. And it teaches them that withdrawal produces pursuit. But eventually, something changes. They disappear. And you don't chase. They expect a message. Nothing comes. They expect you to ask what happened. You don't. They expect you to repair the emotional distance. You allow the distance to remain, and suddenly the silence has a different meaning. This can trigger another attempt to regain your attention, maybe through anger, maybe through accusation, maybe through sudden affection, maybe through a completely unnecessary conflict. The method can change. The objective remains similar: re-establish emotional access. And this is why recognizing the timing is so important. You don't need to become obsessed with predicting every move. You simply need to notice what repeatedly happens immediately before the behavior escalates. What changed? Did you become more independent? Did you say no? Did you stop explaining? Did you stop chasing? Did you begin succeeding? Did you stop reacting? Did you become less available? Patterns become much easier to recognize when you stop looking only at what the narcissist did and start looking at what happened immediately before it. Because sometimes the attack isn't random at all, it's a response to a shift. And the fifth moment is perhaps the most revealing, when the narcissist realizes you're no longer emotionally afraid of their reaction. This doesn't mean you become fearless overnight. You may still feel anxious. You may still wonder what they're going to do. You may still have moments where their anger affects you. But something inside you begins changing. You stop automatically changing your behavior to prevent their anger. That's huge, because if someone has learned that their anger can make you surrender a boundary, cancel a decision, apologize unnecessarily, or abandon your own needs, then anger becomes a very powerful instrument. But when you begin accepting that someone may become angry without allowing that anger to control your choices, the mechanism weakens. You aren't controlling their emotions, you're controlling your participation, and that distinction changes everything. The narcissist can be angry, you don't have to fix it. They can accuse you, you don't have to defend yourself against every accusation. They can misunderstand you, you don't have to spend hours forcing understanding. They can dislike your boundary, you don't have to remove it. And sometimes that is precisely when the attacks become more obvious, because the old methods are producing less effect. But remember something important. The purpose of understanding these patterns isn't to become better at provoking a narcissist or to anticipate attacks so you can manipulate them back. The goal is protection. The goal is awareness. The goal is recognizing that you don't have to enter every emotional battle simply because someone invited you into it. Because the most powerful response isn't always a perfect sentence. Sometimes it's recognizing the pattern early enough that you don't participate in it at all. And once you understand that, the narcissist's favorite time to attack becomes much easier to recognize. It's often when something changes, when you become stronger, when you become calmer, when you become less predictable, when you become less dependent on their approval, when you finally stop giving the reaction the old dynamic was built around. And that is where the next part becomes even more important, because some of the most aggressive attacks don't happen when you're weak. They happen when the narcissist realizes you're becoming free. And this is where the timing becomes even more revealing, because some narcissistic attacks don't happen when you're at your weakest. They happen when you're becoming emotionally unavailable to the old pattern. You may still care about the person, but something inside you has changed. You no longer feel compelled to respond to every accusation. You no longer feel responsible for repairing every uncomfortable moment. You no longer believe that keeping the peace is worth abandoning yourself. And sometimes, that's exactly when the pressure increases. The sixth moment to recognize is when you begin emotionally detaching without announcing that you're detaching. This can be one of the most confusing phases because nothing dramatic has necessarily happened yet. You haven't packed your bags, you haven't announced that you're leaving, you may not even have consciously decided what you're going to do. You're simply becoming tired. The arguments don't affect you the same way, the insults don't shock you the same way. The silent treatment doesn't create the same panic. The apologies don't automatically make you hopeful. You're watching instead of reacting, and that shift can be surprisingly powerful. Because emotional attachment often creates predictability. Someone knows that if they say something cruel, you'll defend yourself. If they withdraw, you'll chase. If they become affectionate, you'll soften. If they accuse you, you'll explain. But when the emotional response becomes quieter, the old cycle loses momentum. This is why you might suddenly notice an increase in provocative behavior. A small disagreement becomes a major accusation. Something from months ago gets brought back into the conversation. A harmless interaction becomes suspicious. Your intentions are questioned. Your loyalty is questioned. Your character is questioned. The objective may not be to resolve the original issue. It may be to recreate the emotional intensity that used to keep you connected. And this is where you need to become extremely careful. Because once you recognize the pattern, you may feel tempted to prove that you're not the person they're accusing you of being. You want to explain every detail. You want to provide evidence. You want them to understand your intentions. You want them to admit that they're being unfair. But sometimes that entire conversation is the trap. You don't have to defend your entire character every time someone makes an accusation. You can ask yourself, is there actually something here that requires my attention? Or, am I being pulled into defending myself against something that doesn't need to be defended? That question can save enormous emotional energy. The seventh moment is when the narcissist senses that other people are beginning to see through the image. This can happen when mutual friends, family members, co-workers, or other people close to the situation start noticing inconsistencies. Again, this doesn't mean everyone will immediately understand what is happening. People often see only pieces. But imagine that the narcissist has carefully maintained one version of themselves publicly while behaving very differently privately. Eventually, those worlds can collide. Someone notices a contradiction. Someone witnesses an interaction. Someone hears a different version of the same story. Someone sees how you are treated, and suddenly the carefully managed image becomes less secure. This can create an increase in defensive behavior. You may become the target of blame. Your character may suddenly be questioned more aggressively. The story may become more dramatic. Old mistakes may be brought up. Your reactions may be presented without the context that produced them. And the reason this matters is that reputation management can become extremely important when someone feels their preferred image is threatened. So if you've ever wondered why a person suddenly becomes much more aggressive after someone else begins noticing the pattern, don't automatically assume you caused the escalation. Sometimes the escalation is connected to the fear of being seen differently. The eighth moment is when you stop accepting the role they've assigned to you. Every long-term dysfunctional relationship can develop roles. One person becomes the apologizer, one becomes the rescuer, one becomes the peacekeeper, one becomes the person who absorbs the anger, one becomes the person who always explains, one becomes the person who keeps giving second chances. And when you stop playing that role, the entire relationship structure changes. Imagine that you've always been the person who says, "Let's talk about it." Then one day you say, "I'm not continuing this conversation while you're speaking to me this way." You've always been the person who forgives immediately. Now you say, "I need time before I decide what I want." You've always been the person who chases after withdrawal. Now you allow the silence to remain. You've always been the person who accepts blame just to restore peace. Now you calmly separate what belongs to you from what doesn't. These changes can feel enormous to someone who has become accustomed to the old arrangement, and the response may be escalation. Not necessarily because your boundary is unreasonable, but because your behavior is no longer matching the role they've come to expect. The ninth moment is when you stop reacting to provocation. This one deserves special attention because it can be misunderstood. Not reacting doesn't mean becoming emotionally numb. It doesn't mean pretending you don't care. It doesn't mean suppressing anger. It means choosing your response rather than giving someone automatic access to it. If someone insults you and you immediately defend yourself, they know the insult worked. If someone provokes you and you spend an hour explaining yourself, they know the provocation worked. If someone sends a message designed to make you jealous and you spend the entire night checking their social media, the message worked. But if you recognize what is happening and refuse to participate, something changes. You don't have to win. You don't have to make them understand. You don't have to produce a dramatic final statement. Sometimes you simply don't provide the emotional material the interaction was designed to create. And this is why calmness can sometimes be more powerful than confrontation. Confrontation still creates a stage. Calm disengagement removes the stage. The 10th moment is when the narcissist realizes you have alternatives. This doesn't necessarily mean another romantic partner. It can mean a life. Friends, family, work, purpose, financial independence, personal interests, confidence, a sense of identity that exists completely outside the relationship. The more complete your life becomes outside someone, the less leverage they have inside your life. And this is one reason healthy independence is so important. You shouldn't build a life outside a narcissistic relationship simply to make them jealous. That still keeps them at the center. Build it because you deserve a life that doesn't revolve around anyone else's emotional state. Build friendships because connection matters. Build skills because competence matters. Take care of yourself because your body and mind matter. Develop your own interests because you are a whole person. Create financial stability because security matters. Do these things because they belong to you. And if someone becomes angry because you are becoming more independent, their anger doesn't mean you should become smaller again. It may simply mean the relationship is changing. The 11th moment is when you stop needing their approval to trust yourself. This is perhaps the deepest shift of all. At the beginning of a manipulative relationship, you may constantly ask, was I wrong? Did I overreact? Was that really disrespectful? Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe I should apologize. Maybe I'm being too sensitive. But over time, you begin developing a different internal process. You still question yourself. Healthy people should be capable of self-reflection. But you no longer automatically assume that someone else's confidence makes them correct. You examine evidence, you remember patterns, you consider your own behavior, and then you make a decision. That is self-trust. And when self-trust becomes stronger, manipulation becomes much harder. Because you no longer need someone else to certify your experience. You can listen to their perspective without surrendering your own. You can hear, you're crazy, and think, that's your opinion. You can hear, you're too sensitive, and ask, what specifically happened? You can hear, you've changed, and think, yes, I have. That last one can be especially powerful, because sometimes you have changed. You've become less tolerant of disrespect, less willing to argue endlessly, less willing to chase, less willing to accept promises without evidence, less willing to confuse intensity with love, and that isn't necessarily a problem. Sometimes change is exactly what healing looks like. The 12th moment is when you begin planning your future instead of constantly analyzing their behavior. This is the final shift. At first, your mind may revolve around them. Why did they do that? What do they want? Are they lying? Will they come back? Are they angry? Who are they talking to? What are they thinking? What should I say? What should I do? But healing gradually changes the questions. What do I want? What do I need? What kind of relationship do I want? What kind of person do I want to become? What boundaries matter to me? What kind of life would feel peaceful? And suddenly, their behavior becomes background information rather than the center of your existence. That is freedom, because the goal isn't to become an expert at predicting every narcissistic attack. The goal is to become so grounded in yourself that you don't need to predict every move to remain safe emotionally. You recognize the warning signs. You recognize escalation. You recognize when you're being pulled into an old cycle, and you give yourself permission to step out. Sometimes that means ending a conversation. Sometimes it means creating distance. Sometimes it means limiting contact. And in situations involving threats, stalking, violence, or other immediate safety concerns, the priority isn't psychological strategy at all. It's physical safety and appropriate professional or emergency support. You don't need to prove that someone is a narcissist before taking harmful behavior seriously. Behavior is enough information. And that's perhaps the most important lesson from everything we've discussed. Stop asking, when will they attack? And start asking, what happens inside me when I recognize the attack beginning? Do I immediately defend? Do I panic? Do I chase? Do I over-explain? Do I abandon my boundary? Or can I pause? Can I breathe? Can I observe? Can I decide? Because the moment you regain the ability to choose your response, the old dynamic begins losing its power. And sometimes the most important sign that you've healed isn't that the narcissist stops attacking. It's that their attack no longer automatically controls what you do next.